Today we're going to talk about how to write an equation of a circle in standard form. But before we have to write the equation in standard form, we have to review a key concept in algebra. So that's what I'm going to spend the first side of this page doing. So if I look at the first two examples, it says a little algebra review, solve for x. So if I look at number 1, how am I going to solve this type of problem for x? Well, because I see an x squared and an x, I know I have to factor. So I'm going to make my equation equal 0 by adding 12 on both sides. So I have x squared minus 8x plus 12 equals 0. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to factor it. So when I factor it, I'm going to factor it with my x method. And I know it's x and x, that's why I set it up that way. So 12 goes on top, negative 8 goes on the bottom. Factors of 12 that make negative 8. Well, negative 6 and negative 2 would work. And that equals 0. And since I have an equal sign, I have to split up my factors and solve for x. So over here, x is going to equal 6, and over here, x is going to equal 2. So my solutions for number 1 should be 6 and 2. If I go ahead and I look at number 2, I'm going to zoom in for purposes of space here. Go ahead and pause this video and you try solving this one on your own. And then unpause the video if you get stumped, or if you think you're good and you want to check your answer. So again, I see that I have an x squared and an x. So I'm going to go ahead and try to factor this. So I'm going to make it equal 0. So I'm going to subtract 2 on both sides. So now I know I have to do the slide and divide or factor by grouping method. So 2 times negative 2 is negative 4, and then I have negative 5. Are there any factors of negative 4 that make negative 5? Well, negative 4 and negative 1 make negative 5, but notice that doesn't make negative 4, that makes positive 4. So there are no factors that would work. So when I have an equation and I can't factor it, does anybody have any idea on what I would do to solve this problem? Well, I would use the quadratic formula. So remember, the quadratic formula is x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So remember, this long and dreaded formula is used when I have an equation that I can't factor. So how many times have I had an equation where I can't factor? Well, this is the first instance. So obviously I don't have to use this formula very often. The nice thing about this formula is it does work 100% of the time, whether it's factorable or not factorable. However, I really only have to use it when it's not factorable. So I have to remember what a, b, and c stand for. So remember, a is always the coefficient in front of x squared, b is always the coefficient of x, and c is always my constant. So if I look at this equation, 2x squared minus 5x minus 2, a would be 2 because it's x squared's coefficient, b is negative 5 because it's x's coefficient, and c is negative 2 because it's my constant. So now I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to plug it into my formula. So I have x equals the opposite of b. So since b is negative 5, the opposite of b is 5, plus or minus the square root of b squared, so negative 5 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 2, times c, which is negative 2, all over 2 times a, which is 2. So now I want to start cleaning some of this stuff up. I know negative 5 squared is 25. Negative 4 times 2 times negative 2. Well, negative 4 times 2 is negative 8. Negative 8 times negative 2 is positive 16. All over 2 times 2 is 4. So now 25 plus 16 is 41. So now I have 5 plus or minus the square root of 41 over 4. So now I'm going to take the square root of 41. I get 6.4. So now I have 5 plus or minus 6.4 divided by 4. So now when I'm only down to numbers, I break it up into its two paths. I have 5 plus 6.4 divided by 4, and I have 5 minus 6.4 divided by 4. So now I'm just going to calculate it. 5 plus 6.4, hit enter, divide by 4, hit enter. X is 2.85. That's one solution. And now I'm going to do 5 minus 6.4, hit enter, divide by 4, hit enter. I get negative 0.35, and that's my other solution. So obviously I end up with decimals because this is not factorable. So just kind of as a little friendly tip, if you were to ever do the quadratic formula and you didn't end up with decimals, chances are you don't end up with irrational numbers. It's because your problem could have been factored. So many people don't like the quadratic formula. Many people think the quadratic formula is too annoying. So in algebra, if we don't like the quadratic formula, we have another method we can use. It's called completing the square. So completing the square is an alternative to using the quadratic formula. So when would I use the quadratic formula? Well, I'd use the quadratic formula when I couldn't factor. So if I don't like using the quadratic formula, when I can't factor, instead I'm going to complete the square. So steps for completing the square. How do I complete the square? Step 1, move all variables to the left. Step 2 is move all constants to the right. Step 3 is complete the square. How? Take half of b and square it. And I'll explain what all this means here in a second. But for now, we're just going to write it all down. So I'm going to complete the square by taking half of b and squaring it. Step 4, factor left side. Step 5, I'm going to solve for x by square rooting first. So these are my 5 steps on how I would complete the square. So before we actually start doing all of these steps, step 3 is actually the hardest, because if you don't understand what it means to complete the square, then you're not going to be able to even do step 3. So we're going to practice by completing the square. So these problems down here are practice. So if you notice I have 2 of my terms, but I don't have my third term. In order to get my third term, I have to complete the square. How I complete the square is I take half of b and then I square it. Remember when we did the quadratic formula up here, b was x's coefficient. So if I come back down to this problem, b in this problem is 6. So I'm going to take half of b. So what's half of 6? Well, that's 3. So now I'm going to square that number. What's 3 squared? 9. So plus 9. That's it. That's how you complete the square. Look at number 2. How do I find b? b is x's coefficient, so b is 4. What's half of 4? 2. Now square 2, you get 2. So plus 2. Let's do number 3. Number 3, b is negative 10. So what's half of negative 10? Negative 5. Square it. Negative 5 squared is positive 25. Notice whenever you square, it always ends up positive. So your last term is always positive. So I want you to go ahead and pause this video, and I want you to do 4, 5, and 6 on your own. So I put the answers on the board, so hopefully you got the same answers. If you didn't, make sure you ask questions. So now before we move on, we're going to factor the left side. So I'm just going to factor each of these expressions, and I'm going to factor them in blue. So if I look at this problem and I draw my x, 9 goes on top, 6 goes on the bottom. Factors of 9 that make 6, 3, and 3. So I have x plus 3 x plus 3, and I can write that prettier by saying x plus 3 squared. If I come down and I look at number 4, again, draw my x. 400 goes on top, 40 goes on the bottom. Factors of 400 that make 40, 20 and 20. So I have x plus 20, x plus 20. So I can rewrite that prettier, x plus 20 squared. Let's now do number 2. Draw my x. And I did number 2 wrong, actually, now that I'm looking at it. I hope you all caught that before I did. If you look at number 2, if I take half of b, it's 2, and then if I square it, it's 4. I don't know if I said that when I was originally talking, but that should be plus 4. So now I have 4 here, and I have 4 down there. Factors of 4 that make 4, 2 and 2. So I have x plus 2, which is x plus 2 squared. Are you noticing that each of these end up with x plus or x minus whatever squared? Because that's where they get the word complete the square. Let's do one more. Factors of 1 that make negative 1. Oop, I did that one wrong too. Hooray! I hope you're all focusing and knowing exactly what I'm doing, because clearly I'm making boo-boos. That should be 1/2. Nope, that should be 1/4. Because half of 1 is 1. No. Half of 1 is 1/2. If I square 1/2, I get 1/4. So now if I factor, I have 1/4 on the top and negative 1 on the bottom. How do I get 1/4 as a product but negative 1 as a sum? Well, that'd be negative 1/2 and negative 1/2. So that's just x minus 1/2 squared. And I hope you also notice that this number here is just whatever half of b was. Half of b was 2, half of b was 1/2, half of b was 3, half of b was 20. I'm going to go ahead and skip 3 and 6, but if you need to factor for extra practice, go for it. So now let's start solving some of these problems. I'm going to follow all of these steps to solve this equation. So, step 1, move all my variables to the left and all my constants to the right. I kind of do step 1 and step 2 at the same time. So if I go through, I'm going to look for my constant. And this is my constant. I always circle it so my brain knows where it's going. So I'm going to leave x squared minus 4x on the page, on the left, leave a blank, and I'm going to move 6 to the other side by subtracting it. So that was step 1 and step 2. Step 3, complete the square. So I'm looking at this side and I'm going to complete the square. So what's half of b? So b is negative 4. So half of b is negative 2. Now I'm going to square negative 2. Negative 2 squared is 4. So I'm going to add 4. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I just magically added a number to my equation. To keep my equation balanced, because I magically added plus 4 over here, I have to magically add plus 4 onto my right side as well. So now I have to start cleaning stuff up. And I have to make a tiny typo, righto. That should not be plus 6, that should be minus 6. So since that's minus 6, this is going to be plus 6. And the reason why is because my answer is not going to work out. So, okay, easy boo-boo. So now let's fix the left side. I'm going to factor it. Factors of 4 that make negative 4. Well, that's negative 2 and negative 2. So that's just x minus 2 squared. And 6 plus 4 is 10. So now, step 5 says I'm going to square root. First, I'm going to solve for x. So I'm going to square root on both sides. So now I have x minus 2 equals the square root of 10. Now, ladies and gentlemen, your teachers have been telling you that whenever you square root a number, it's always positive. That's not always the case. Whenever you square root a number, it's really positive or it's negative, which is why I have to put plus or minus in the front. So whenever you square root a number, it's always plus or minus. So, and the reason why is if I plug in, let's just say I have x squared equals 25. If I square root, x is plus or minus 5, because when I square root, I get positive or negative. If I plug in 5 and I check it, 5 squared is 25, yes, that holds. If I plug in negative 5 squared, that also makes 25, so that also holds. Which is why we have been fibbing to you thinking that your only answer was positive when really it's plus or minus. So now from here on out, every time you square a root, you have to plus or minus. So now I'm going to solve for x by adding 2 to both sides. So I have x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 10. So I can do 2 plus the square root of 10, which is, if I just write all my work down, so that means x is 5.2. Or I can do 2 minus the square root of 10, which is negative 1.2. So if I go ahead and I look at number 2, you can go ahead and try this one on your own, or you can watch me as I do it. So I'm going to find my constant, and I'm going to circle it to tell my brain it has to go to the other side. So now I have x squared plus 6x. I'm going to set myself up for good habits by leaving a blank, and to move 1 to the other side, I'm going to subtract it. Now I have to complete the square. So how I complete the square, I take half of b, so b is 6, half of 6 is 3, square it. I now get plus 9. Here's where everybody messes up. Because I magically add 9 to this side, I have to magically add 9 to that side. So now I'm going to factor my left side. So factors of 9, that makes 6, 3 and 3. So I have x plus 3 squared equals 8. Now I'm going to solve for x by square rooting first. So I have x plus 3 equals plus or minus whatever the square root of 8 is. So I'll just leave it plus or minus the square root of 8. You can convert it to a decimal if you want, say if I can type right into my calculator, 2.8 if you'd like. So now I'm going to subtract 3 on both sides. So now I have x equals negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 8. So this could either be negative 3 plus the square root of 8 or negative 3 minus the square root of 8. So negative 3 plus the square root of 8 is negative 0.2. And then I have negative 3 minus the square root of 8, which is negative 5.8. So, some people like completing the square better, some people don't like completing the square better. The point of completing the square is when you can't factor an equation and you don't want to use the quadratic formula. So the big question is, okay, fine, how do I apply this to circles? Why am I wasting my time learning this, again, if I don't need to use it for the class that I'm taking? So how does this apply to circles? So let's talk about the standard form of circles. The standard form equation of a circle, remember, is x minus h squared plus y minus k squared equals r squared. In order to write an equation of a circle, I need to know 2 things. What 2 things do I need to know? I need to know the center, and I need to know the radius. So, when an equation is not in standard form, I have to get it into standard form by completing the square. So the steps for how I would do that are very similar to the steps that we just did on the other page. However, we're not having to go all the way to solving, which makes it a little bit nicer. Step 1. Step 1, I'm going to move all variables to the left. And constants to the right. Oops, if I can spell. Constants to the right. Step 2, I'm going to group all x's together and y's together. Step 3, I'm going to complete the square on both variables. So now with a circle equation, I have an x and a y, so I'm going to have to complete the square twice. Step 4, I'm going to factor the left and clean up the right. So if I look at these problems, I'm going to follow all of these steps to help me put the equation in standard form. If I look at this equation right here, can you immediately determine what the center and the radius is? No, because it's not in the form x minus h squared plus y minus k squared equals r squared. So if I look at this equation, I'm going to do step 1 and step 2 at the same time. Step 1 said to move all my constants to the left, all my variables to the left and all my constants to the right. Step 2 said I'm going to group my x's and my y's together. So I'm doing the same thing as the other side. I'm going to preview for my constant. Here's my constant. I'm going to draw the arrow to move it to the other side. I'm not going to group my x's together. I have x squared plus 16x. I'm now going to leave a blank. Plus y squared minus 22y. I'm now going to leave a blank. And I'm going to move negative 11 to the other side by adding it. Step 3 says I'm going to complete the square on both variables. So if I look on this term, just on my x's, I'm going to complete my squares on my x's. So I'm going to take half of b. So b is 16, so half of 16 is 8. And then I'm going to square 8, which is 64. Because I magically added 64 over here, I have to magically add 64 onto my right side. I'm now going to complete my square with my y's. So I'm going to take half of b, so b is negative 22. So half of negative 22 is negative 11. I'm now going to square negative 11. I get 121. Because I magically added 121 on my left side, I'm going to magically add 121 onto my right side. Step 4 says factor each variable. So if I look at my x's, I'm going to draw my x's, 64 and 16. Factors of 64 that make 16, well that's 8 and 8. So I have x plus 8 squared plus, I'm going to factor my y's. Y's, I have 121 on the top and negative 22 on the bottom. That's negative 11 and negative 11. So that's y minus 11 squared. And then I'm going to clean up my right side. So my calculator, I'm going to type in 11 plus 64 plus 121. I get 196. Notice this right here is my standard form of my circle. My center would be the opposite of x, which is negative 8, and the opposite of y, which is 11. That's my center. And my radius is the square root of 196. 14. And I'm done. Let's go ahead and let's look at number 2. Number 2, step 1. Move all my constants to the left. No, move all my constants to the right and all my variables to the left. And while I'm moving my variables and my constants, I'm going to group my x's and my y's together. So I have x squared minus 12x, leave a blank to set good habits, plus y squared plus 8y, leave a blank, and then move 32 to the other side by subtracting it. So now I'm going to complete the square of my x's. So half of negative 12 is negative 6. Negative 6 squared is positive 36. Because I magically added 36 to the left, I'm going to magically add 36 to the right. Now I'm going to complete my squares on my y's. Half of 8 is 4. 4 squared is 16. Because I added 16 to my left side, I'm going to add 16 to my right side. I'm now going to factor both of these. So I'm hoping you're noticing it's going to be in this form. And I'm hoping you're being able to find shortcuts. If not, you can draw the x's and keep going. Factors of 36 that make negative 12. Well, that's just x minus 6 squared. Factors of 16 that make 8. Well, that's just y plus 4 squared. And now I'm going to clean up. Negative 32 plus 36 plus 16. I get 20. So now notice I'm done. This is my equation in standard form. So if the directions ask me for the center, I could say the center was what? 6, negative 4. And my radius is the square root of 20, which is 4.47, which is closer to 4. Let's go ahead and let's look at number 3. Number 3, why don't you go ahead and try to pause this video and you try to do this problem on your own by completing the square. Obviously, if you need more assistance, I'm going to start explaining it. Otherwise, you can fast forward to the answer when you are finished. So I'm going to find my constant, move my constant to the left. So now I'm going to group my x's. I only have an x, so I can't group them. And then I'm going to group my y's, leave a blank. When I move 4 to the other side, the right side becomes 5 because 9 minus 4 is 5. So notice x doesn't have anybody to complete the square with, so I don't have to complete anybody with x squared. X squared's done. So I just have to complete the square with y. Half of 4 is 2. 2 squared is 4. And then add 4 to the other side. So now I'm going to factor. That's going to be y plus 2 squared equals 9. Notice I'm done. So what would my center be? 0, negative 2, and my radius would be 3. Go ahead and do the same thing for number 4. Pause the video, try this on your own, fast forward to get the answer, or obviously if you need more help, you can have me explain. So I'm going to find all my constants, and I'm going to move them all to the other side. So I have x squared minus 4x, leave a blank, plus y squared plus 10y, leave a blank. And then I have 9 minus 25 minus 4, which is negative 20. So now I'm going to complete the square on my x's. Half of negative 4 is negative 2 squared. I get plus 4. So I'm going to magically add 4 over there. Now I'm going to complete my squares on my y's. Half of 10 is 5. 5 squared is 25. So now I'm going to factor. I get x minus 2 squared, and I get y plus 5 squared. Negative 20 plus 29 is 9, and I'm done. If I wanted to find the center, I could. So notice these examples down here said find the center and the radius. Just by looking at this equation, could you determine the center and the radius just by looking at it? No. Why not? It's not in standard form. So I have to first put it in standard form, just like I did on all these problems up here. And then I have to find the center and the radius. So I want you to go ahead and pause this video, and I want you to do, let's just do number 1. Just do number 1. Solve number 1, find the center and the radius. When you are finished, unpause, and the answers will be on the board. So the answer should be, the center should be 2, 3, and the radius should be 2.2. If you're okay with this, you can flip to the next page. If you're not okay with this, I recommend trying number 2. The answer to number 2, my center is 2, negative 5, and my radius is 3. If you're good, you can skip number 2. I'm fine with that. All right, let's look at these ones. It says graph. Can I instantly graph this equation? No, because it's not in standard form. In order to graph it, I need to know what the center and the radius is. So I want you to go ahead, pause this video, and I want you to solve this problem, find the center and the radius, and then graph it. When you finish, unpause the video and you can see your answer. I have the answer on the board. If you have questions on this specific problem, make sure you come and you ask me. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and move on. I'm going to skip these 2 practice problems. If you need the additional practice, you're more than welcome to do them. The answers are, for this one, the center is 1, 2, and the radius is 2.8. And then this guy down here, The center is 5, 4, and the radius is 3. Last piece I need to talk about is in order for an equation to be a circle, there cannot be any coefficients in front of x squared or y squared. What do I do when I have that issue? If I have a coefficient in front of x squared or y squared, it's not a circle, it can't be a circle. So to be able to get rid of that coefficient is I'm going to divide every term by that coefficient. So if I look at this first example, I see that x squared has a 4 and y squared has a 4 as a coefficient. So I'm going to divide every single term by 4. So now I'm left with x squared plus y squared plus 8y minus 36 equals 0. Now I'm good to go to put it in standard form. So group all my x's together, group all my y's together, move my constants to the right. Complete the square on y, I get plus 16. Factor the left side, I get y plus 4 squared. 36 plus 16 is 52, and I'm done. So go ahead and try this last example, and then find the center and the radius as well. So if I find the center and the radius, where did I mess up? Oh, I messed up. Haha, I hope you see where I messed up. That right there, 36, should not be 36. What should it be? 36 divided by 4 is 9. So that should be 9. So 9 plus 16 is 25. So my center is 0, negative 4, and my radius is 5. Glad I keep all of you on your toes by all of my little boo-boos I've been making on this today, but fortunately I've been able to find them. So go ahead and try this last example. When you finish this last example, unpause it. The answer will be on the screen. If you have questions, make sure you come and you see me.